them for anybody who wants to look up anything that I've said by way of a reference. So let me see if I can share. Are you all seeing that?
Yeah, that's working.
Yeah, that's working. Always good. So, first of all, I wanted to acknowledge Rebecca's opening words there, and the acknowledgement that people on the call may well be affected by the issues that we're going to talk about tonight, and the potential upset or re-traumatization from that. And I think that that's a really pertinent and important thing to do when we are talking around such issues. So let me start off by saying a little bit about what we're talking about here and what is the problem. Now, I'm going to use a couple of different terminologies this evening, and I might use them interchangeably, but I would just want to think about some of the terminology as I'm moving through the presentation, and I'm quite happy to discuss it more fully because we will have the time to do so. So broadly speaking, I'm referring to gender-based violence, which is a very generic umbrella term for a raft of different types of violence that are perpetrated against people. And we are all gendered in some way. However we identify with that, we are all gendered. So to some extent, you could say that gender-based violence affects everybody in different ways. It's understood quite often and by the World Health Organization, for example, the United Nations, as being interpreted predominantly as being violence against women and girls because they are, or we are, disproportionately affected. And also some types of violence are perpetrated against women and girls because of them being women and girls. And I'm going to say something more broadly about gender inequalities a little later on in the presentation. But as was quite rightly said, gender-based violence as an overall form of violence against women and girls affects about 1 in 3 women in their lifetime. Now, 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence. And I think Louise is going to say something more about sexual violence. But here's another term, intimate partner violence. So just for clarity then, intimate partner violence is, as it suggests, the type of violence that happens between current or previous partners that have been in intimate partner relationships. So it's one of the myriad forms of gender-based violence against women. And violence against women is lethal. And here we have on the slide 38% of murders of women are committed by an intimate partner. It's a shocking statistic, and we see this a lot in the media, and the horrendous reports around women who are often in the first instance missing in an unexplained way, and then through investigations are found to have sadly been murdered by their intimate partners. And the last slide is referring to another particular form of violence against women, FGM, and 200 million women have experienced FGM worldwide. Now, these statistics are from the World Bank, and these are really just to set the scene in response to the question I posed at the beginning about what is the problem here. Violence against women in its broadest sense, gender-based violence against women, is a big problem and is very diverse in the way that it manifests. I was struck by the kind of what I understood to be a fairly global interest from the group, or certainly from a lot of the members anyway. Some of you will be acutely aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations SDGs. And what I'm talking about this evening in relation to gender-based violence and domestic violence specifically, very much aligns with one of the 17 SDGs, and this is Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is around gender equality, broadly speaking, and one of the specific aims and targets within that is to end violence against women and exploitation of women and girls. As I said at the beginning, I've got a number of different things to show you, just to dip into the issues really, and to maybe for the first time introduce some resources or some literature or some papers and policies, etc. This is the power and control wheel that is used in a program called Duluth. It's the Duluth model. If you're familiar with it, some of you may have heard that terminology. And it's a way of, well, it's used in different forms, actually. It's used on perpetrator programs so that perpetrators of violence can understand their behavior. And it's also used in kind of recovery programs as well for those who've been victims of violence or survivors of violence, in this case, domestic violence, can have a look and begin to understand violent behaviors and what the characteristics and the behaviors of somebody who perpetrates abuse look like. And I don't need to look into these 8 different domains in any great length for the purpose of our presentation, but suffice to say that domestic violence comes in very many different forms. It's sometimes physical, almost always emotional in some form. And the reason why power and control are right at the heart is that power and control are understood to be the mechanisms by which almost all domestic violence takes place. And for our purposes this evening, the one that I really want to highlight as being significant in the context of COVID-19 is isolation. Because what I'm going to talk about in some of my slides that follow is how isolation as a strategy to deal with the pandemic has had catastrophic effects for people who have often for the first time experienced domestic violence, or have been in relationships anyway, in intimate partner relationships where violence has been present that has been exacerbated by isolation. So that's why I've indicated, out of all of the different forms of abuse, the isolating strategies that have been used by perpetrators, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So just to focus on what I've been asked to do is to explore and begin a discussion with you around the pandemic, around COVID-19, and what's been happening nationally and what's been happening globally in relation to domestic violence. So we know a lot of things, but there's still a lot to know, which is what I'll say a little bit more about. But we do know that right the way across the world, reports and calls to domestic violence services have risen, broadly speaking, and they've risen exponentially during periods of lockdown. And this notion of shadow pandemic has actually been coined by a lot of people, but the United Nations were one of the first to pick up on this notion or this reality that in amongst the global pandemic of COVID-19 was this emerging, to start with, realization that there was also a shadow pandemic of domestic violence happening for very many women and girls right the way across the world. And it is difficult to tell, but there are some estimates that indicate that the increase, that exponential increase that I talked about, was likely to be in the tune of a rise of about 20% during lockdown. And the around what fuels or causes domestic violence in the first place are massively complex and debated. You know, the roots of it, what is it that causes it? And they are too complicated and complex for us to do justice in our conversation and in presentations this evening. But when it comes to understanding domestic violence within the context of a pandemic, then the work of Peterman, and I think I've put the references at the end, is a really good read in helping to understand some of the factors that are associated with this increase. You know, what is it behind it then? And there is the element of economic stress. I mean, we've all been in lockdown, and I think that is a useful reference point for us to all sense the emotional difficulty of being where we have been in our own homes or in our own halls or wherever we've been. The economic stress, whatever sector we're in, whatever our status economically, that the financial pressures for a lot of people have been immense. And there's also been the increased potential for perpetrators to exploit their power and their coercion and their control, because in many cases, perpetrators have been locked into a relationship, into the same environment as their victims, and so the situation is absolutely ripe for them to be able to exhibit and execute those exploitative behaviours. And another factor, which is I'll try and say a little bit more about, is the reduced options for support. We know that victims of domestic violence are very reticent about coming forward and seeking support. There's myriad reasons why that is the case. But when you are locked down and isolated and in an environment where you're distant from your family and friends and your social networks, and the resources that you might seek help from are closed down and working remotely also, then it creates a very, very complex picture of difficulty in accessing the support that you would perhaps otherwise at least be able to have access to in a practical sense. And we do know, and that there's I'm referring to some seminal work of Stark here, Evan Stark, who wrote about isolation several years ago. But what we do now know in a current context is just how desperate the isolating situations and the isolating mechanisms of perpetrators have been for many people. And so I've talked about the kind of the parallel pandemic and that kind of way of understanding domestic violence. And another terminology that's been used quite extensively is the notion of a perfect storm. And this really picks up on what I was saying before, is that the very fact that perpetrators have, in many cases, the same environment as their victims, and they're isolated, hidden away actually behind closed doors from the people who may ordinarily be able to reach out or just offer a helping hand or an inquiry about whether or not everything's okay. That has created a perfect storm in order to exacerbate domestic violence in an unprecedented way. And Usher and colleagues, Usher is an academic from Australia, her and her colleagues have written quite a lot about mental health. If any of you are interested in mental health, then she is a mental health professor of, I don't know if she's a professor of mental health, but she's certainly a professor who knows a lot about mental health. And she's written about the specific features of abusive relationships in the context of the pandemic. And she, in her talking about a perfect storm, has referred to containment. So being in that contained space and perpetrators really taking advantage of that. And exhibiting and exercising that coercive control. The fear that goes with that in a very understandable and real way. And the mechanisms that some perpetrators have used around the threat of contagion itself. So using the very risk of contracting the virus as a mechanism to control and to isolate. So those three things kind of coalesce to make a very difficult and dangerous situation for many women. And this is a fairly recent report that has been released by Women's Aid. Women's Aid are a national charity, a national organisation that are at the forefront of offering support for domestic violence victims. They also have very comprehensive support for victims and survivors of FGM as well. And they've written this publication. I think it was published in February, so it's a fairly recent read, where they've looked at the impacts of the pandemic on domestic violence and some of the strategies that they've used to help mitigate that kind of isolation that a lot of survivors have experienced. And for example, I'll say a little bit more about this, but Women's Aid have done a very, very good job of reaching out remotely to survivors and altering their mode of practice in order to keep as many women and their children safe as possible. And they talk about perfect storm as well. So I just wanted to think a little bit more globally, really, and to pick out some of the country specific increases that I've mentioned already. A lot of my own research and my own writing around domestic violence has been in the UK, although not exclusively. But I really like this illustration of a resource that is produced by a part of the UN Women, that really does capture, I think, the kind of geographical spread of the problem. So 243 million women have been subjected to sexual and or physical violence, and the kind of geographical spread and incidence is there for you to see as data from 2020, really at the beginning of the lockdowns as they were taking place there. And I don't really think I think it speaks to for itself, really, in terms of just the breadth of this problem, and that's completely understandable, really, because although domestic violence might be contextual, it may be slightly different in some cultures and some contexts. In many ways, it's pervasive, and its main characteristics are around coercion and control. So to that extent, it's a global phenomenon that represents a serious threat to women and girls worldwide, wherever they are. I just need to keep a quick time check here. And what I wanted to highlight there was the emerging data. So this was, as I said, last year, and data regarding the significance of the problem are still emerging. So what I would have really like to have done would have been to join you this evening and to provide a comprehensive profile of this is where we're at. These are the definitive statistics. This is the definitive picture that we get of the problem with domestic violence and its nature during COVID-19, but there's still so much to be understood. I just wanted to mention this paper primarily because it has been quite important for myself and Louise. Louise and I co-authored an editorial that has been ridiculously well cited for what it is, and I think there's some significance around that. I'm not just saying it to promote something that we've written, but right back over well, actually just under a year ago, an editorial was published. This one, myself and Louise wrote it, and it was a fairly tongue-in-cheek pop at our political system that at the time was advocating stay home, protect the NHS and save lives. And what we said in the editorial was, okay, that's very, very wise words. We need to do that to prevent the global pandemic of COVID-19. But what does this mean for domestic violence survivors? So Louise and I were some of the first to be raising this as a real issue at the time. So this was published last April, and in it we were saying, well, yeah, okay, but there are serious problems here, and there was emerging data at the time to say about the increased calls to helplines, etc., that I've already talked about. And if I remember, I'll say something about why this is, the fact that this has been quite important. I'll come on to it, as I say, if I remember. So what we were trying to say in that editorial was that home is definitely not a safe place to live for many people anyway. And that goes back to Rebecca's point at the beginning, I think, about this is, an uncomfortable subject we're talking about here. There's one in 3, 1 in 4 women have been affected by domestic violence, either personally or through somebody that they know. Less so for men, but men and boys experience domestic violence as well, and those in same-sex relationships. It's pervasive, as I've said. But when we think about the isolation and the control that I talked about before in the context of COVID, that home is ever less safe than it has been for very, very many people, and it's not the safe haven and the home sweet home that we would like to think it is, or that we could naively think is the case. So I think that was the key to that editorial that we wrote there. And when we wrote that, Louise and I referred to it as a paradox. And so I just wanted to say a few more words. I don't want to hog the time. I need to let Louise speak, but I just wanted to say some more words about paradoxes, because this is a more recent editorial that I've written with a colleague from Finland who does a lot of work around stalking. Now, domestic violence survivors, when they manage to leave an abusive relationship, are by no means safe. And a lot of domestic homicides, a lot of murders of women, the women I've mentioned already, when they're murdered, they are murdered mostly after they've exited a relationship. It's a seriously dangerous time. And so what myself and Anna wrote about in this editorial was the paradox about safety and the easing of restrictions, because once women are free to leave, what if they've been confined and constrained within an abusive relationship during lockdown, then we know from perpetrator behaviors that once somebody begins to regain some control, regain some autonomy, that really does exacerbate the dangerousness of and potential lethality of the situation, and the perpetrators usually become far more serious and far more determined to exert control. So it kind of becomes an escalating situation, We just have explored in that editorial about the paradoxes of what you would consider to be increased safety that are often not. And then finally, the data paradoxes, and I've screenshot these so that you've got them for reference if you want to have a look at them at any point. What I want to say about in this particular slide is just how little we know about the true picture of violence against women and girls during COVID, how little we know truly about domestic violence rates, because it's really difficult to get accurate pictures anyway. But when we're trying to research into the lives of people who are affected by something as serious as COVID-19 and then domestic violence, it's really problematic to get that accurate picture that we really do need. And that's what both of these pieces of information are talking about, really, both originating from the United Nations. I really love this flow diagram, but you'll have it for reference. For reference here, it's got multiple authors. They're all there acknowledged on it. This is a screenshot of a resource that's available, and really this is referring to the safety of trying to collect data when we are dealing with violence against women and COVID-19. And it's like a decision tree, really. I mean, that is what it's called, about when is it safe to do that and when are we able to ask women about their experiences and when are we not. And if we had time to study it, it's a really very interesting flowchart. So let me just really lead on to my last couple of slides before I hand over to Louise to talk through her presentation. Really, when we look at the global context of gender-based violence more broadly, and domestic violence being part of that, it really fits into much broader gender inequalities that are affecting women and girls worldwide, and they are impacted in certain contexts far more than others, particularly when there are areas of conflict, when there is fragility, and in amongst that, when there is violence in its myriad forms. And all of those serve to exacerbate and worsen the already increasing inequalities that so many women and girls face as regards health, education, employment, etc. Anyway, so this domestic violence I'm talking about now is just one small but absolutely significant part of this massively complex situation. Just finished now, I'm going to talk about responses. I think it would be to problematize domestic violence as a terrible thing. It's worsened during the pandemic because that is what we know has happened. It'd be wrong of me to say that without talking about some responses. So from the World Bank again, I really love this infographic of some of the different types of interventions that are happening across the globe in response to the shadow pandemic, as they call it, that are around. The pale blue is about the justice system, the pink is about increasing resources, purple media campaigns, and then the green is about innovative ways of offering support. I mentioned before about Women's Aid and the way that they've begun to operate remotely because they have to. And the spread there shows you about those different interventions across the globe. And I cite the World Health Organization a lot because I'm a health researcher essentially, and this is their guidance for what we can do to address violence against women during COVID. So, and finally, just for any of you who are interested in working in countries, particularly in the global south, and for any of you who are interested in how to do that in a way that is safe and ethical and fair, when it comes to thinking about gender and gender-based violence specifically, then my colleagues and I produce these guidelines called Engage guidelines to ensure that what we do is ethical and safe in those contexts. So I have done probably a little bit too much talking, and I need to hang on, just need to stop that. I need to hand over to Louise, but what I've hoped to do there really is to paint a picture as clearly as I can around the problems of domestic violence generally, the fact that it is a problem across the world, and is one that disproportionately affects women and girls. And what we know so far is just how much that has increased and worsened for a number of different reasons during COVID-19. And I've also tried to show some hints of what is being done in different places across the world in order to make women and their children as safe as they possibly can be, given the circumstances. So I think I'll leave it like that, and pass over to our chair.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Caroline. We know it's a really tough topic to spend such a little time on, but you did an amazing job just giving an overview. If you have any questions for Professor Caroline, please save them to the end of the session, because we'll be moving on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Louise Isham. And she is a research fellow at the University of Birmingham Institute of Applied Health Research, and she's a registered social worker as well. And she'll be talking to us about the impact of the pandemic on specialist sexual violence services.
Great. Thanks very much, Uma. I'll also try and share my slides. Sorry, let me just... Great. For those, can everybody see them okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Lovely. Okay, well, hi everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. Really pleased to be here. As Uma said, my name's Louise. I'm a research fellow at the University of Birmingham. I'm going to be talking today about a study that I work on with Caroline and our colleagues based in Birmingham, but also working with health professionals, commissioners, with leads of specialist sexual violence voluntary services, and with survivors. I'm going to be outlining some of the findings of our study in its initial phase, talking about the unique role, the contribution of the voluntary sector, particularly around sexual violence services, but many of the themes that I'll be talking about are applicable to the wider, what's usually called the VAWG, violence against women and girls sector, which is historically been led and based in the voluntary sector in the UK and in England in particular. I'm then going to just spend some time at the end of the presentation talking about some of the things, some of the emerging data, some of the trends, certainly not significant research that we've seen around the role of, about some of the particular issues facing survivors in the pandemic in the UK, and some of the particular issues facing these specialist services working alongside them. I just want to clarify in terms of terminology, as Caroline was saying, there's clearly overlap between domestic abuse and sexual violence when it's happening within intimate relationships, present or past. However, usually within the UK, the sexual violence sector is kind of seen as a slightly both specialist and slightly wider, in that many of the people accessing services might be survivors of childhood abuse or children and young people themselves. It could be familial abuse. It could also be sexual violence through stranger crime or other types of crime, including trafficking and modern slavery. So the services there's certainly overlap between them, but they also carry out kind of different types of specialist work. So just as background then, when we talk about specialist voluntary sector, in England, we mean those services that work exclusively with survivors and where staff have built up a detailed knowledge of sexual abuse. They understand its political and social dimensions, and that feeds into the way that they work with survivors. More broadly, there's not very much research about these services, and in particular in comparison with NHS and social care services. But we do know through often research led by the sector and increasingly some independent inquiries and some academic research, is that survivors often prefer these services. They rate them very highly and they often return to them throughout their life course, as many survivors experience physical, emotional, psychological and social impacts of abuse throughout their life, and the importance of continuity of care and having the ability to access support is key. This is why our study adopts a theoretical framework. It's by two academics called Billister and Glenister, and it's really trying to explain why, not just in the UK but across the world, why the voluntary sector could be NGOs, different types of non-state and non-private providers, can be particularly well placed to support marginalised and vulnerable groups. And in this case, we think it's a useful theory of understanding sexual violence survivors who often do experience many forms of disadvantage. And they argue that some of the reasons why these organisations are well placed is because they have flatter organisational structures, i.e. there's less distance between those at the top and the bottom, and there's much more shared decision making and shared forms of work. That these services are often rooted in their communities, both in terms of their volunteer base and their staff base, and also in terms of the flow of knowledge and understanding, where they're based, who they work for, who they work alongside. And probably one of the most key things, and something that maybe lots of people would recognise about the voluntary sector, is it's often mission-led and driven by a core value or ethical framework. That's not to say that we think all voluntary sector services are the same, or that the quality of them is all the same, but we find this a really compelling and helpful framework to try and understand the role of sexual violence services, in particular in England. I'm just really briefly going to draw on some of the interview data that we gathered in the first stage of our 3-year study. And this was carrying out 25 interviews with specialist workers, often who worked in the sector for many years, and people who commissioned and organised those services, asking them to reflect on what it is about the sector that's unique, as well as the challenges it faces. We also carried out work with survivors, but I'm not going to draw on that data here. So as you can see from this slide, the evidence of flatter organisational structures was really key in lots of the participants' accounts. Participants often described how survivors were embedded into different levels of their organisation, allowing for a unique understanding of survivor need and a level of closeness that might not be afforded by other types of services. Another dimension is that of foregrounding service user voice. So as many of the workers and volunteers outlined, but also in terms of active engagement, and that survivors really were seen as driving the agenda of what these organisations did, how they responded and evolved, and sometimes when they said no to working in a certain types of way. This is really clear from participant 2 here. You know, you have to listen to the groups that you need to work with to find out what they want, not what you think they want. Perhaps an obvious thing to say, but sometimes very difficult to operationalise in the competitive and quite precarious environment that many of these services do work with. In terms of closeness to communities, this was something that really spoke, participants said, to understanding their needs. And as participant 10 says, we can look at data and information, needs and trends much more quickly because we're nearer the ground and the people we support. So that sense of being embedded, having that really reciprocal relationship between what's going on, what's happening to the people they support and the wider community, and being able to feed that into ways of working and also advocacy and the political work that these organisations do. Certain participants also talked about the importance of volunteers in particular, and the reciprocal relationship that they had, where there were these flows between the community and the work. It's also true to say that often within specialist services, there's a strong heritage of people being survivors coming to volunteer and coming to work within them. And often many of the people we spoke to, and it is more broadly true, people staying within the sector and sometimes one organisation for many years, sometimes their working life. So there's a very strong sense of commitment and loyalty to these areas, and that experiential, that lived knowledge is as important or valued in a very significant way alongside certain types of professional knowledge. In terms of being mission-led and driven by values or an ethical purpose, key to this for the participants we spoke with was situating sexual violence into that broader understanding of gender inequality that Carrie mentioned, recognising and trying to make that really visible in their work, trying to empower and support survivors to also see some of those connections as a way particularly of trying to challenge narratives of self-blame or kind of a more what might be seen as a pathologizing way of understanding particularly psychological ill health. There was also a strong commitment to upholding values of kindness and compassion and trying to foster trust, and that was really important to many of the organisations and practitioners. And that's really clear here with participant 8. It's also an organisation, aside from all these services and all these things they do, that's an organisation that offers care, that offers support, that's compassionate, and it's also empowering as well. So these factors, although, as I say, there's no homogeneity across the sector, they do help us understand why survivors might find this different from some forms of clinical provision and different from accessing statutory services, i.e. those where the state is in control of the service and it has statutory responsibilities, the independence and the values and purpose that they have being key. And it's perhaps unsurprising that within these types of organisations, practitioners work in a certain type of way, and that they're very key to embodying and, you know, realising the principles that I've outlined here. And we found that in the interviews that we carried out, that they were very much shaped by these principles. There was a lot of references to participants going the extra mile about this being a very vocational form of work, more than a job. And this sense of it really is said here by participant 10, you know, it's not just work, it's part of workers' values, their being, their bones, their structure. It's really lived, embodied and committed, and that high level of loyalty that they have was really strong. And it was also expressed in terms of the level of anger and frustration they felt at some of the injustices in the system, some of the injustices they saw working with survivors, some of the frustrations about the precarity of this work. You also see here some of the embodied references, you know, the love and the feeling and the rewards that many people spoke about, particularly working directly with survivors. I'm briefly now going to explore just some of the themes or some of the key issues around the pandemic and its impact on victim survivors of sexual violence, and explain why that might be affecting or how that affects some of these services. We know, we have reports of, mainly through these types of organisations with helplines, with workers on the ground, with connections in their communities, that there's been a rise in online sexual harassment and abuse. And in particular, there's a spotlight and concern about children and young people, particularly as they've been at home more and out of education, particularly with issues around supervision and the grooming and harassment that we know is already a huge problem. But it is important to flag that this can also be true and is true around adult spaces, particularly in terms of dating apps and other forms of online abuse. So there's concerns around a kind of slow, hidden rise in these forms of harms. The pandemic has also exacerbated what many of you, I'm sure, know is already a crisis in the criminal justice system. At the start of the pandemic, rape prosecutions were at a historic low in England and Wales, and there is every reason to think that problem, although extremely well known and extremely well talked about and researched, will be exacerbated. For a long time, trials weren't being carried out, and the backlog that was several years long in some areas has risen. There's also, because of social distancing, it's only recently that jury trials have been re-implemented, and that's patchy. There's also a real stretching of the specialist staff, both within the criminal justice system and the specialist staff in the types of services I was talking about who advocate and work with survivors in the court system. They are now carrying caseloads of people who were already waiting for trial, as well as new people coming through. So there's a real concern about the quality and level of support to survivors, now unfortunately in even more limbo. Touching on many of the themes that Carrie talked about, there's also concerns about the increased risk of sexual abuse within intimate relationships and familial, particularly when we're talking about children who are vulnerable. Because many of the services that directly go into people's homes, for example, social work or health visiting or specialist outreach, as well as community-based services, have not been around, there's a real concern that there has been more license for this type of abuse, and it's been even more complicated for help seeking. We also know that women with, talking to some of the issues Carrie raised, with unsettled migration status and with particular economic precarity, there's a concern that they may be forced into what can be called survival sex and the increased risks of violence associated with that, as well as other forms of abuse and exploitation. What we know from specialist services that we've spoken to is that, as with many others in the women's sector and of course the wider health sector, there's been huge innovation and a real rapid move to trying to innovate and support survivors as best they can. There's been many services that have moved online or to blended delivery when that's been possible with the different phases of restrictions we've had, particularly in terms of online counselling and chat, but also peer group spaces, again promoting that holistic sense of safety for survivors, so enabling online tours of museums, online zoos, connection for peers to continue that type of support for those who can't take part in counselling. And while that's to be really welcomed and praised, clearly things are extremely disrupted still, and there are real limitations to virtual only provision or very heavily relying on the virtual. Of course, there are issues around access, digital poverty. There's also safe space for engagement. Many of the people that may be using these services, home may literally not be a safe place because of abuse and risk, but it might not be a safe space emotionally to kind of carry out the more in-depth therapeutic work that many of these services provide. Many survivors have opted not to be carrying that out, that type of work, in their own home, understandably. It's also particularly challenging to carry out this work with much younger survivors who, for whom play, for whom body language, virtual communication is not appropriate and it's not safe. However, that means there's been a year in which many of these younger victims have come forward and not been able to access quality support or had it disrupted. We would also flag that it's important to understand, if working in a holistic way, the impact that this has had on workers. The emotional complexities of carrying out work in the sexual violence sector, therapeutic practical advocacy, are immense, and they're also extremely rewarding from practitioners. However, carrying that out within their own homes with that real blurring of space and that lack of being able to connect with often very valued colleagues has had its emotional toll. And it's important to flag it's predominantly a female workforce, and there are many issues, as I'm sure you're aware of the extra burdens that have been disproportionately fell on women in terms of the care and education work that they've been carrying out. So just briefly, some concluding thoughts. The sector has welcomed the somewhat belated but happy to know that there's been a shift in government recognition, amplifying that sexual violence is now being seen and spoken about as separate from, but as important as, domestic violence. It shouldn't be any sort of competition between them, and it's not between people in the sector, but it's important to get that spotlight and understanding that there are different people affected by this issue. There's been some ring-fenced funding to help services as they innovate and as they stem the kind of loss of fundraising that they've had and the additional problems that they faced to going online and having things disrupted. And charities have also played a key role in making that funding available. However, we do need to recognise that the increases in demand, some of the reasons I've outlined here, this was already a sector that had huge demand and huge precarity and instability in terms of its funding and services. And unfortunately, these trends are really likely to increase. And there's a concern that there will be some form of surge that they're already seeing in the months and years ahead. This is at a time when the structures about how these services are organised and funded hasn't changed. And there's a real worry that the crisis and the kind of raised visibility of violence against women and girls, it's not always relating to support to specialist services. In fact, it's somewhat of a paradox that the crisis funding is often going to services that actually aren't specialist services, and that smaller voluntary organisations, those in the grassroots, aren't always able to meet the kind of needs of government funding and commissioning. So with all of this happening, that might seem like quite a dry point, but it's important to realise there's a real window of kind of changed recognition and need for support here, but we need to make sure we're understanding the long-term problems and the long-term context in building on from the pandemic. Thank you very much for listening. I'm really happy to answer any questions and engage in the discussion.
Thanks so much, Dr. Louise. I think I'm gonna pass on to Maria next, and she's gonna later the chat.
Hi everyone. So thank you, Dr. Louise and Dr. Bradbury Jones for those presentations. They really set the foundation for our questions and discussions. I'm just going to kick off. Oh, sorry. I'm just going to set a few rules. So if everyone has a question, please put your hands up, and feel free to unmute yourselves to say your questions when I call your name out. And if you would rather, you can also just type the question in the chat, and I will read it out for you. I think that's clear enough. Let me know if it isn't. And I'm just going to kick off the discussion with a question that we were interested in, which is, what do you think were the effects of COVID on women refugees and the support that they provide?
Shall I start off? Yeah. What we know about the pandemic, generally speaking, and what we know about it in relation to domestic violence specifically, is that there are certain sectors of the population, certain communities who have been absolutely disproportionately affected. And when thinking about and researching into the experiences and the inequalities of Black, Asian, minority ethnic women and girls and refugees, what we do know is that the impacts on them have been high in terms of prevalence, but also as regards access to services. And I've actually been at a presentation earlier on today where a lot of the focus is on the issue of no recourse to public funds and the lack of access of a lot of women to domestic violence services, and the massive inequalities experienced by women, and in this case, in answer to your question, refugee women. So a really good question, because of all the women who have refugee status are going to be overwhelmingly I don't know, discriminated against and experience significant inequalities as regards their health and their access to services. Without doubt, I think there's indubitable evidence for that to be the case.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Louise, did you have anything?
I mean, I think Carrie covered a lot of the key issues there. I mean, I guess picking up on in terms of formal services and advocacy, I mean, that's a problem that amplifies those in terms of the social inequalities that, I guess, drawing on some of the things I was mentioning there are very few advocacy and support organisations for refugee women, particularly experiencing violence. And it's very difficult for them to have the kind of political traction and sway that is needed. And at a time when it can feel like there are somewhat competing vulnerabilities, it's very easy for that voice to be not heard. And I think there's better understanding of that in the wider kind of violence against women and girls sector, the need to actively champion and support refugee women, but I think there is a risk of their voice it consistently not being heard and not always having the kind of strength to advocate for themselves, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We have a question from Sarah. In your opinion, what is the impact of the current major economic vulnerability for women who are being victims of domestic violence?
Mm-hmm. I'll respond to that in the first instance, if you like, as well. I did talk about in my presentation the economic vulnerability for women, which is a feature of domestic violence anyway. But we know from the media, from the press, what the very stark inequalities for women generally when it comes to childcare, when it comes to impacts on their employment, the homeschooling, all of those things that are not directly COVID, that are not they are COVID related, but are not relevant to domestic violence. But when we add domestic violence as another factor, what we can see then is a potential or actual exacerbation of the vulnerability of women economically. And in my presentation, I focused a lot on coercion and control, and money is a very powerful mechanism and a very powerful way of exercising control. So just like other forms of abuse, the economic angle is one that's really important for us to be considering. But like a lot of other forms of domestic violence, it's not very visible. It's really difficult for anybody to get a sense of when economic abuse is taking place in people's lives, because when I say some of the other forms of abuse, I'm also talking there about a lot of abuse is really hidden, and most domestic violence is not physical violence, and it's just so very easily obscured in what's happening in people's lives. And I'm just I've just noticed one of the other questions, which was about the longevity, really, of the impacts. And I think that those two things linked together. Somebody posed a question about whether or not the impacts will be felt of domestic violence going forward, and I think they will. And the economic impacts no less than any other forms of domestic violence either. So I think without doubt they will be far-reaching and will be felt for a very long time at an individual level, but also at a kind of societal political level as well. Louise, have you got anything to add to that?
I think it's fairly comprehensive, Carrie. I think very much all of those things. I guess the one thing that perhaps just reflecting on a kind of tension, talking about some of the economic pressures and its link with abuse. And it's really clear that there is an association between deprivation and poverty and higher levels of violence, just like there is with crisis emergency situations and higher levels of violence. But we have to be a bit careful about not talking about things as causation, that sometimes there's maybe an argument that economic stress in itself doesn't cause violence, and being mindful about it certainly can exacerbate the kind of precariousness and the ties of coercion for victims, but that there are lots and lots of people who experience economic hardship and violence and abuse won't happen. So we just have to, it's always something that's quite difficult to talk about, I think, within the sector, around why explaining it but also not seeing it is inevitable kind of causal factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think the question by Becca was answered by you. So I'll move on. We have a question from Helen. Do you think the heteronormative language surrounding gender-based violence makes it harder for LGBT+ individuals to seek help?
Yeah, that is a stonking question from Helen there. I really like that. And what Helen has done is raised a really pertinent question, and it's a really thorny issue. There are massive debates within the domestic violence services, particularly those that are for women, so Women's Aid, for example, and overtly feminist movements tend to be at loggerheads with other organizations or other communities, and specifically transgender support services, for example. And there have been long-standing tensions sometimes between feminist perspectives and those of kind of non-binary and other communities. So yes, I mean, heteronormative language in any context. I mean, I work in healthcare, and there's a lot of research, a lot of policies that are aimed to reduce heteronormative language and heteronormative policies, etc., etc. And that's no less the case when we're dealing with a problem as widespread and pernicious as domestic violence. And I'm very aware that within my presentation, I talked about violence against women and girls, and I think I might have mentioned violence against men and boys as being kind of, and also very binary language, and some people would argue that that those types of reference to men, boys, and women and girls is not helpful when it comes to non-binary individuals. And so we have to be attuned to the different ways of thinking about the problem, thinking about the challenges. And so my own stance now, this is the way I approach my own research, and we'll all hold different ways of viewing the situation, I guess. My approach is to say that violence against women and girls, in the way that I've talked about it in my presentation, as a form of gender-based violence, is the most prevalent form of violence, gendered violence. But that is not to undermine the violence that happens to men, boys, transgender individuals. You know, really, it's not. That is serious and wrong. And so I always put that, I think, really necessary and important acknowledgement in what I'm talking about, and I hope I did that today. And I suppose my own philosophical, or my own, it's not philosophical, it's a human, my own, the way I approach it from a human rights perspective is to say that no individual should experience discrimination, no individual should experience violence in their lives, whatever whatever their status, wherever they live, however they identify as regards gender, sexuality, ethnicity, whatever, the raft of other factors. So violence is wrong and needs to be eliminated.
Thank you. Dr. Isham, do you have any thoughts to add?
I guess maybe from the perspective of sexual violence services and maybe the wider kind of sector and research, very much, echo that it has been a barrier. There's no doubt about it. It has been very problematic, and that's not to misunderstand or undermine how difficult it's been for a voice for feminist advocacy and for a voice for women and girls, which is still extremely problematic, but it has been very difficult, particularly for transgender people who are much more at risk of some forms of sexual violence, and particularly thinking when many survivors who are adults, survivors of childhood abuse, the paucity of services for men and boys, and those that are tailored and actually can be accessed, even if they're nominally open for them, that they feel comfortable to access, shows clearly that there's still a long way to go in terms of provision. Unfortunately, when there's just not enough anyway, and it's so stretched, that's where some of the arguments are. The provision hasn't changed, at the level of pace that it needs to in terms of social understanding and of demand.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't see any more questions in the chat, but I do have one from our own list, which is kind of focusing on the more international context. How does the UK's domestic abuse policy compare to other countries?
Wow.
That's a big question.
It is. It is actually. We have well, in comparison to some countries, the UK is significantly advanced in our understanding, our policies around domestic violence, and what we do have in the UK currently going through, and hopefully soon to be enact, is our domestic abuse bill, which I think today was being debated in the House of Lords. I think it's been going on for a few years now, and in comparison to a lot of countries, the UK is going to benefit from the very very iterations that has gone through, and it's going to make it's going to put into statute or many things that are going to make our country, or the UK, safer for victims of domestic violence. So for example, it's going to mean that for victims of domestic violence are no longer going to be cross-examined or questioned by their perpetrator, because up until now that can happen in court. So that's going to be a significant protective factor. But there are so in comparison to a lot of countries, I do work on the east coast of Africa, and our policy status is just not comparable, basically. And the same is the case for a lot of low and middle income countries. Louise and I had the benefit of going to India, was it last year, Louise, or the year before perhaps, and really it's the world's the way that families live, the lives of women and girls is just so very different in those countries that we've been in and we've worked and researched in, that it's very difficult to compare them. But I wanted to make reference to the domestic abuse bill because it's a very important policy. However, there are big limitations in what it does to protect women. We talked about migrant women or refugees earlier on, but it doesn't protect women who have no recourse to public funds, and so that's a massive gap in our policy for a significant amount of women in the UK who will continue to be unprotected. So, but that's a very, very interesting question. I don't know whether Louise has got anything to add to that.
No, I think just emphasise your point without wanting in any way to detract, because the bill is really important, and the symbolism is important. The symbolism is important, that these issues are being debated publicly, that we're trying to enshrine things in legislation, that it's being challenged where the parameters are of what's constituted as abuse and where the law should protect it. It holds a lot of importance. However, it really is only one tool in the toolbox. You know, the criminal justice route is only a route for a very small really number of survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. It doesn't work in itself, and it can't work until there's wider social change and there's wider therapeutic and support and advocacy services to support victims to get to that point, and that particular form, however important it is, of justice. So it's a really good step, but it can never in itself be just criminal justice that is a sign of how well a society understands.
Sorry. Yeah, I just had a follow-up question on what you said about sort of the domestic abuse and gender-based violence being quite different in India. So I'm Indian, and in Indian culture, arranged marriage is a very common phenomenon, and domestic abuse within that has been quite normalized and taken a sort of has become part of culture, and the role of a traditional Indian wife, and especially in terms of financial control and pressure on to reproduce. So in that context, when women and society in general are not really identifying that as domestic abuse, and they're not actively seeking support for that, how do you bring up the topic of domestic abuse?
I mean, that's a really good question. It's really good, and I guess what I'm saying would in no way fully answers, the complexity of the situation you're talking about there, Lenny. But I think it's important to recognise the language we use and the way we conceptualise these things. It does need to be socially sensitive, and it's okay and it's appropriate that there's different ways of kind of understanding and coming to terms with some of the terminology around things. I guess, what at the heart of some of the issues you're talking about are deep gender inequalities, and ones that are perhaps in some areas so accepted or normalized by women and men that they can't be seen, and that makes it much harder to then articulate, let alone do anything about. So sometimes kind of thinking about how do we, and there's no easy answer to this, create behavioural change and social change. Well, that's much more complex. We might not be talking there about focusing just on domestic violence, but broader campaigns that are about understanding gender roles and moving towards gender equality, about challenging some of the behaviours that go on within the home. For example, there's some research to suggest that it's good when it's peer-led. For example, it's by couples who have also experienced this. It's by men within that community. It's very much locally led. And so you're talking about challenging or trying to raise discussions in the first place about what some of these attitudes and norms are. So I think it's extremely difficult, but that work is that can seem more subtle and less explicitly about abuse and violence is crucial, especially when we're talking about educating the next generation. And that work is really important to go on alongside, of course, good legislation, support services, clear messaging, but you can't jump to all of that stuff without trying to engage with some of the deeper issues, as you say, at the same time.
Thank you.
And Louise knows so much more about the Indian context than I do. I mean, I've just been there a couple of times, but I've just had the most amazing and exhilarating conversations with youngish girls and younger women about how they want to have a very different life. They look to the older women in their communities and they say, this is not what I'm going to have. This is not how I am going to live my life as a young woman, or as a woman going forward. So I think, like all communities, and in that respect, I would say that India as a country is no different to anywhere else, is that it's changing those attitudes, changing the cultural norms as early as possible, with everybody, you know, irrespective of whether they're girls or boys. If we get the young children and address the problems there, getting them thinking in their own context, in their own communities, and in their own families, what, for example, safety looks like, that will be very different, obviously, contextually. But if we can get young children thinking about that, and if they're allowed and able to debate it even, then we're in a really good place potentially. And I know in those in the classroom conversations, I'm thinking of a particular instance now, with a group of young girls in India, just how inspired I was, really, because what I saw in them was just a significant amount of empowerment. Now, whether they'll ever be able to really fully enact that empowerment, but I felt hope that they if anybody could, they would, you know. So that's great to think about that. Thank you for the question, Lenny.
Thanks, Lenny. I am aware of the time, so I think we'll just have a last question. Did I see a hand up from Mia?
Yeah, sorry. If my internet cuts off, it's just because the office's internet is really bad. But I was asking a question kind of around whether stigma plays in a part of why people choose not to report or really interact with the concept of domestic violence. So I teach sex education in Cairo, and I know that a lot of women who describe situations describe being raped by their partners, and think that that's quite a normal thing to be occurring for them. And when you let them know that that would constitute as sexual abuse or domestic abuse or anything, they're like, no, my husband wouldn't domestically abuse me. This is just an example, but do you think the stigma kind of feeds into why people maybe struggle to identify the issues and choose not to really like conceptualize what's happening? I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've just my screen is frozen in the most unpleasant looking way, which I can see, but I'm hoping you can't. Yeah. Undoubtedly, stigma plays a significant part, and in all forms of domestic violence, but probably as much as anywhere in relation to sexual violence. So Louise may have more to say, but shame and stigma and also the effects of gaslighting, in other words, being told constantly and over again that you are in some way to blame for your own violence, and that you're not worthy of anything better, and that you will not be believed, etc. if you try to tell somebody about what's happening to you.
Carrie, your sound's gone.
I think there was a network failure.
Yeah, I think she's dropped out.
Louise, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just picking up from what Carrie was saying, really, certainly I think stigma is a huge issue, particularly sexual violence, but all forms of violence, particularly within the family or an intimate relationship. And that stigma is about, as Carrie was saying, a kind of internalizing, often of blame, the convenience that serves. But it's important to recognise, stigma is socially constructed. It reflects the feeling of unsafety and the feeling of fear that people there's a real reason why they have that trepidation and feel that taint because of their experiences, because they don't perceive or see or feel that maybe those close to them or their wider society is able to understand their experiences and that will support them. So there's unfortunately we see the stigma that carries around survivors, particularly, for example, around doubting their veracity, doubting their responsibility, about the taint that it carries, particularly sexually for women with future partners and their children. And it's that coalescing of things that people internalize, and it absolutely can be changed and challenged. And it's just one example of many, but there's some of the organizations I was talking about, that's key for them, is recognizing stigma is everywhere around with sexual violence, so we have to make it core in our work. And that's why naming it and trying to explore it and unpack it can be perhaps the most important and powerful first step, supporting people to disclose or seek help. Often it's some time from when they did experience harm.
Yeah, I mean, the work that the organizations do sounds incredible. I think just looking at the time, we seem to have lost Professor Carrie, but thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for coming. I think I hand over to Lenny right now.
Yeah, so right before we wrap up, just want to say a massive thank you to our incredible speakers this evening. We've lost Professor Caroline Bradbury Jones, but Dr. Louise Isham is still here. So if you could all just unmute for a moment and give them a round of applause, that would be great. Okay,
thank you.
We really appreciate you sort of taking the time today to share your knowledge and insights on this really significant topic, and to keep this conversation on domestic abuse going forward. Students for Global Health and KCL Sexpression are also organizing another event with MP Afsanah Begum on April 22nd this year, to talk a bit more about the laws and policies regarding domestic abuse in the UK. So please keep an eye out on our socials, which is in our Instagram and Facebook pages, for more updates on this event. Next week, Students for Global Health are hosting their 5th event in the short course on marginalized groups, and the topic is prisoner health, with speaker Miranda Davies from the Nuffield Trust. They're also hosting an event tomorrow on careers in global health. So if you're interested in attending, I will pop the link, the Facebook event link in the chat. Sorry, that's the wrong link, my bad. All right, so it's the second link. The first link is for the feedback form for this evening. So if you could please fill those out, it will just be 2 minutes, and it would really help us as event organizers as well as the speakers to get some feedback from the attendees. It will also sort of register you as having attended this event for the short course certificate. And we'll also send you the slides from this evening's presentations via the email that you put into these feedback forms. Right, KCL Sexpression will also be hosting events on the sex lives of Indian women, sexual racism and fetishization. as well as a talk on sex work. So please keep an eye out on our socials for updates on these events as well. I think that's all I have. So thank you so much, everyone, for